Here's a question for you. Say you want to set a budget. What's the first thing you do? Well, you count. You count the money you have, how much you make, and your expenses. Taking inventory is the obvious starting point. Now, how do you count something that refuses to sit still, is spread across a few hundred square kilometers of jungle, only comes out at night, and actively avoids you? Or, put in a way that stops burying the lead, how do you count the tigers? Well, for most of history, you didn't. You just had to guess. Seeing a tiger is rare, and actively seeking them out or hanging around them tends to be bad for human life expectancy. The practice became counting signs of tigers rather than the cats themselves. Things like prey tigers had killed, footprints, and scratch marks were how scientists estimated tiger populations. But guesswork isn't very accurate, and when we're talking about wildlife conservation, the numbers being off can have disastrous effects. Indian tiger populations in the 1970s were at the brink of extinction until the country embarked on reforms and research that have reshaped how we think of wildlife conservation entirely. Conservation used to be done quite narrowly, often little more than straight head counts for a species. Maybe populations over time would be charted, but not much more than this. The problem, beyond just trying to get a good estimate of a species' numbers, is that spreadsheets don't tell you the whole story. It's also important to understand what the species needs, how it interacts with its environment, and what threats exist to it. A tiger needs prey, prey need habitats, and habitats need undisturbed space. A head count can tell you how many tigers there are, sure, but nothing about what sustains them in the long run. For a long time, these two pieces, counting and protection, were broadly two different fields. The problem is protection is useless if you don't have the hard data to tell if something is working, and numbers are worthless if you can't understand what drives them. Each part depends on another. India's breakthrough was treating these as two components of one problem, and letting each one check the other. But backing up to the 1970s, India didn't have this solution and novel approach. Instead, it had a crisis. At the beginning of the 20th century, tigers were not a rare animal. India alone had about 20 to 40,000 of them in the country, though that is just a rough estimate. Colonial rule under the British Empire would batter this population for two main reasons. Tiger hunting in India dates to at least the Mughal Empire, though mainly as a form of pest control to keep so-called man-eating animals away from the populace. Under British rule, tiger hunting greatly expanded and took on an industrialized nature. Tigers were labeled as vermin by colonial authorities. They made agriculture and settlement more difficult, with many living in forests Britain wanted to cut down for lumber, and in areas where they wanted to build railways. Quickly, cash bounties were offered for killing tigers. In some regions, the colonial authorities hired dedicated professional hunters and tasked them with eradicating the local tiger population. The colonial government even gave out the title of Tiger Slayer as a military appointment. Technically, the British were also the first to pass a law protecting tigers, that being the 1912 Wild Birds and Animals Protection Act. In reality, this was to create game reserves for the British elite, amongst whom tiger hunting had become a fashionable and prestigious hobby. Tiger populations continued to fall when India gained independence in 1947. Trophy hunting by Europeans and Americans became very common, essentially replacing the British hunters. In the 1950s, a fur wave also swept Europe and North America. A good tiger fur coat could easily fetch over $10,000 in the West, making this a valuable source of currency for the developing nation. Additionally, the partition of India following independence had led to a refugee crisis, and many were resettled in formerly undeveloped areas, taking habitat from wild tigers. The numbers from this period are, as mentioned, shaky, but it seems there were only 4,000 tigers left in India by 1953, 2,000 by 1964, and 1,800 in 1972. The collapse was becoming hard to ignore, right as the International Union for Conservation of Nature was scheduled to have its General Assembly meeting in New Delhi in 1969. During this meeting, the Assembly passed a resolution calling for a moratorium on tiger hunting, which landed hard in a country where the tiger population was rapidly thinning. It marked a major shift in how India thought about the environment and conservation. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, herself a wildlife enthusiast, wrote to the head of the Indian Board for Wildlife, Karanth, citing a report that the tiger population in the country had fallen to as low as 1,500 and asked what the states were doing about it. By 1970, tiger hunting had been banned across India, and both the US and UK had banned the import of tiger skins. The bans were a good move, of course, but it only served to stop the bleeding and not truly solve the issue. The international community wasn't convinced India would follow through, so the World Wildlife Fund offered financial assistance if India made more concrete moves towards saving their tigers. Gandhi was determined to act and set up a special task force reporting directly to her the next day. Headed up by Karanth, the task force produced a roughly 100-page report proposing that a handful of the best existing sanctuaries be enlarged into fully protected, scientifically managed reserves. That same year, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 was passed, which gave the effort something it hadn't really had, in a universal law tackling the issue, affecting the whole country. The previous patchwork of state-by-state laws was replaced with one big national law. The act imposed a nearly total ban on hunting the animals it protected, with only narrow exceptions. A wildlife warden could only authorize killing a top-protected animal only if it had turned dangerous to human life or was diseased beyond saving. It also sorted species into different schedules, determining how much protection each one received. Tigers went right into Schedule 1, the highest level of protection. The act also let the government carve out protected areas, like national parks and sanctuaries, which gave what was known as Project Tiger some real territory to work with. Project Tiger was launched on April 1, 1973 by Indira Gandhi at the Jim Corbett National Park. It was a huge step forward, but reserves and laws only matter if you can tell whether they're working, and that meant someone still had to count the tigers. The method they went for had been in development through the 1960s by an Indian forester named Saroj Raj Chaudhuri. Inspired by the old hunting practice of tracking tigers by their tracks, he built a counting system around the pugmark, from the Hindi pag meaning footstep. The idea was that one tiger's print is distinctive enough to tell one animal from another, so you can make casts of the print across a reserve, match them to individuals, and add them up into a population. It looked rigorous, and it was a real step up from vague guesswork. It was low-tech, cheap, and didn't require hiring more people, making this a very appealing solution. But the system was far from perfect. For starters, it required scouring hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of forest and jungle, most of which isn't very accessible. In some reserves, as little as 10% of the territory was searched. Even in what was searched, finding tiger prints is hard. You're looking for fairly indistinct markings that may or may not be in the mud or soil. Identification also relied entirely on human judgment, and those humans tended to report tigers with a bit too much certainty. A range of error was never reported, always a firm number that wasn't really grounded in reality. For a while, the numbers looked really good, and Project Tiger was accomplishing what it set out to do. Through the late 1970s and 80s, the censuses showed tiger populations growing, and India seemed to be an example for the world about just how quickly a species can bounce back once the pressure on its habitat is eased. Ranthambore National Park became the showpiece, going from around 14 tigers in the early 1970s to about 40 by the 1980s, with tigers so easy to spot that photographers came from around the world to see them. The amount of tiger reserves in the country also grew from the original 9 to 15 by the 1980s. But the good news didn't last. In the late 80s, the South China tiger was practically wiped out in the wild, hunted down in part to supply the traditional Chinese medicine trade. Tiger bone, ground up or steeped in wine, has been sold as a treatment for things like rheumatism and general vitality, though its supposed medicinal benefits have never been scientifically proven. This is the same trade that hunts rhinos for their horns, pangolins for their scales, and bears for their bile. A wave of poaching swept India. In 1993, a raid on a house in Delhi turned up 400 kilograms of bones from 30 different tigers ready to be sent to China. 94 tigers were reported poached in 1994, and 116 in 1995, and those are just the ones we know about. The tigers at Ranthambore, which had been the pride of the whole project, mostly disappeared, but the official numbers showed no real change. This was the problem with the pugmark census. It was a system that tended to overcount and wasn't great at admitting to failure. It was more meant to produce a reassuring-looking number, rather than alert people to a crisis. But not everyone was convinced by these official numbers. Since the mid-1980s, a wildlife biologist named Ullas Karanth had been working in the forests of southern India and had been developing a completely different way to count tigers. His objection to the pugmark census came down to a few considerations. When you survey for tigers, you're only ever covering a fraction of the total habitat, and within that fraction, you're only ever finding a fraction of the tigers actually there. Any realistic count has to account for both of these limitations. The pugmark census just assumed they had a 100% find rate, that teams had searched everywhere, and they'd found every tiger that there was to find. Across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of forest, that was never close to true. Karanth's argument was that tiger monitoring has 3 levels of difficulty. The easiest is just mapping where tigers are and aren't, flat out where the populations are. The next step up is tracking whether a particular population is trending up or down, which is generally good enough data to make decisions about. The third, getting an exact count of a population, is hard and needs technical machinery to pull it off, but if you're clever about it, you only need it in a handful of critical places. The problem with the pugmark method is that it was trying to achieve the hardest objective, getting an exact count, with the crudest tools available. Nobody needed an exact tiger count for the whole country. What they actually needed to know was simpler. Which forests still have tigers, and are the numbers in each one going up or down? Answer those two, and you'd know where to send rangers, and you'd notice fast if a reserve was in trouble. Instead, every year, India tried to count every tiger in the country individually, and got a number that couldn't be checked, couldn't be questioned, and came with no margin of error. Karanth also made the point that we don't accept this anywhere else. No pollster calls every voter before predicting an election. They get a sample, and they find the margin of error. Tigers are far harder to find than voters, and somehow the standard for this was a perfect head count. In 2003, Karanth and several colleagues published all of this in a paper. Their conclusion was that India's official tiger numbers were essentially meaningless. Not too high, not too low, just unrelated to how many tigers were actually out there. They were proven right 2 years later. Sariska Tiger Reserve in Rajasthan had been reporting a healthy tiger population for decades. In 2005, investigators found the reserve had no tigers left at all. Every single one had been poached, and nobody had any idea. This was a reserve, not some unmonitored patch of jungle. People were supposed to be monitoring this. A task force appointed by the Prime Minister scrapped the pugmark census, and India rebuilt its tiger count from scratch. The old method's final estimate in 2002 had been around 3,600 tigers. The first count under the new system came back with 1,400. So, if you evidently can't count tigers by their footprints, then what's the plan? Karanth had spent 20 years working on exactly that, and his answer started with letting the tigers take their own photographs. The trick is to stop trying to see every tiger, and accept that you never will. What you can do instead is work out what fraction you're seeing. This idea goes back to an 18th century French mathematician called Pierre-Simon Laplace, and it's called Capture-recapture. You go out and catch some animals, mark each one so you can tell it apart later, and then let them go. Then repeat this process. Some of the animals you catch the second time will be new, and some will be ones you've already marked. The ratio between those two groups is the useful part. If you're catching mostly already marked animals, then you've probably seen most of the population. but if you keep finding more unmarked animals, then there's clearly more out there you haven't counted. Do this enough times, and you can calculate roughly what percentage of the population you're catching in any given sweep, and once you know that, you can work backwards to the total. Say a survey catches and identifies 20 tigers. Based on how often the same individuals keep turning up, you estimate you're catching about half the animals in the area. That means the real population is somewhere around 40. You never saw the other 20, and with the system, you never needed to. There's one problem though. Capture-recapture normally requires you to physically catch animals and mark them with rings, tags, or bands. This is fine for fish or birds. It is a considerably worse idea with tigers. Fortunately, tigers arrive pre-marked. Every tiger's stripe pattern is unique, and the same is true of leopards, jaguars, zebras, and plenty of other animals. There's no need to catch a tiger and paint a mark on it, because, as Karanth wrote, luckily for us, nature has done that job already. You don't have to catch a tiger to identify it, you just have to photograph it. So that's what was done. Automatic cameras were set up along trails tigers were known to use, and overnight, tigers would trigger them. The next morning you'd have a set of photographs, and each tiger able to be identified by their stripes. When the numbers were tallied up and the statistics made, the results revealed one thing. Tiger population densities vary wildly, and are affected by the availability of prey above all. In the Sundarbans mangroves, which are poor in prey, there were less than 1 or 2 tigers per 100 square kilometers. In the grasslands of Kaziranga, packed with deer and other hoofed animals, it ran as high as 18. This might sound like a fairly obvious finding, but it conclusively reframed the entire issue. It's not about tiger populations outright, it's about how much there is for them to eat. A tiger kills something roughly once a week, so about 50 animals a year. A mother with cubs needs closer to 70. But you can't have a forest where exactly 50 deer die every year and nothing else lives there, because prey animals need to breed fast enough to replace what's taken. To sustainably produce 50 kills a year, the forest needs a standing population of around 500 deer and pigs. Now, this works in reverse, too. For every 50 deer killed by people in a year, there's prey for one less tiger. Nobody has to shoot a tiger for that tiger to disappear. This turned out to be the real reason tigers were scarce across much of Asia. Not poaching, at least not primarily. Every day, thousands of villagers go into the forests near their homes to shoot, snare, and trap exactly the animals tigers eat. Outside a handful of well-protected reserves, this had pushed prey populations down to the point where the forest simply can't feed a big cat anymore. This is why the solution came down to land. Territory had to be kept intact enough to hold the entire food chain tigers need, which is what reserves became. The core areas were kept as strictly protected as possible, with human activity pushed to the buffer zones around them. This worked, though it came at a cost. Many villages located within the reserves had to be relocated. In some cases, the residents were given adequate compensation. In many cases, they weren't. But the ecological logic held up. Protect the land and the deer came back. Bring back the deer and the forest can feed tigers again. So, how did it go? In 2006, the first count under the new system found about 1,400 tigers. By 2010, the number was up to around 1,700. By 2022, the number was around 3,600. India now holds roughly 3/4 of the world's wild tigers, across 58 reserves, up from the 9 it started with in 1973. Honestly, it was really tempting to frame this story as a country deciding to save an animal and then doing it. But that isn't what happened. India spent 50 years being wrong in a series of increasingly informative ways. But that's also the reason it worked. India kept finding out it was wrong, and kept being willing to act on it. Most countries facing a wildlife crisis don't get that far. They pass a law, declare the problem handled, and stopped looking. India kept looking, threw out its own national census when the evidence said it was worthless, and rebuilt the whole thing from scratch. The payoff also goes way beyond tigers. The methods developed in the forests of India have become the basis of modern wildlife conservation globally. Cameras on trails, individual animals identified by their markings, capture-recapture statistics to estimate the rest, turned out to work on almost any animal wearing a pattern. It's now standard practice for leopards, snow leopards, jaguars, ocelots, and a long list of other species on nearly every continent. A problem that started as how do we count tigers in India ended up as one of the core tools of modern wildlife biology. Researchers using it today on animals that have nothing to do with India are working with a technique that exists because Indian conservation had a measurement crisis and decided to solve it properly.
आपण जो नंबर डायल केला आहे तो इनव्हॅलिड आहे. कृपया डायल केलेला नंबर तपासा.